The morning she tucked that $20 bill into the pocket of my cardigan, she did it the way you hand $1 to a stranger asking for bus fare. Quickly, without looking at me. Her fingers barely grazed the fabric before she stepped back and said those words with her voice already turned toward the door, already moving on to the next thing on her list, already done with me before she had even finished the sentence. Don't come back. I stood in the foyer of the house where I had lived for 31 years. The house where I had painted every room myself, choosing the colors with care. Sage green in the kitchen because it reminded me of the hills where I grew up. Warm ivory in the hallway because Harold said it made the space feel like a welcome. The house where I had raised 2 sons, buried a husband, kept a garden that neighbors used to stop and comment on when they walked their dogs past in the evenings. The house where, 7 months earlier, my youngest son Daniel had asked me, with tears in his eyes that I now understood differently, if I would consider moving into the smaller bedroom so that he and his wife Renata could have the master. Just temporarily, Mom. Just while we get settled. I stood in that foyer with $20 in my pocket and my Goodwill coat already on my back. She had handed me the coat first, before the money, before the words, as if she had planned the order of it, and I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not say all the things that were rising in my chest like water against a locked door. I said, all right then. And I walked out. My name is Cecilia Margaret Voss. I am 72 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a woman who has ever needed rescuing. I spent 40 years as the invisible engine of everything around me, the person who made sure the bills were paid and the pantry was stocked and the school forms were signed and the grief was managed and the dinners were cooked and the medications were remembered and the feelings of everyone else in the room were carefully, quietly tended to while my own sat folded on a shelf somewhere, waiting for a moment that never quite arrived. I was competent in the way that women of a certain generation are competent, which is to say I was competent in ways that nobody counted. When Harold died 4 years ago, I thought the hardest part was the grief. The particular silence of a house that used to have another person's breathing in it. The way I kept almost saying his name when something small and funny happened because 43 years of marriage means your instinct is always to turn and share the moment, and the moment when you remember there is no one to turn to, that moment never entirely stops hurting, it just changes shape over time. But the grief, it turned out, was not the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after. Daniel and Renata had been living in a 1-bedroom apartment across town, and there had been a conversation, several conversations, about whether it made sense for them to move in with me while they saved to purchase their own home. Daniel had framed it, at the time, as mutual. You wouldn't be alone, Mom. You wouldn't have to worry about anything breaking and not knowing who to call. We could look after each other. It would be good for all of us. I believed him. I believed him because he was my son, because I had watched him grow from a small boy who slept with a stuffed rabbit named Gerald until he was 9 years old into a man who cried at his father's grave and held my hand through the whole service, and because I wanted to believe that the loneliness I was feeling was something that could be solved by proximity to the people I loved. I gave them the master bedroom. Daniel had asked for it with such careful, gentle language that I almost missed what he was actually asking. He talked about Renata's back problems, her need for a certain kind of mattress, the way the master's ensuite would make mornings easier for both of them. What he did not say, what I only understood later, was that Renata had already decided, before the conversation ever happened, that the master bedroom was going to be hers. Daniel was simply delivering the message in the softest possible wrapping. I moved into the smaller room at the end of the hallway, the one that had been Marcus's when the boys were growing up. Marcus, my older son, who now lived in Portland with his wife and their 2 daughters and who called me every Sunday without fail, who had come to stay with me for 3 weeks after Harold passed and had cried in the kitchen while he washed the dishes because he said it was the only way he knew how to be useful. Marcus, who did not know what was happening in his mother's house. Not yet. The first months with Daniel and Renata in the house were not cruel. They were something quieter than cruel and in many ways more corrosive for it. Renata rearranged the kitchen without asking, explaining that the old system wasn't efficient. She replaced the coffee maker with a sleeker model and put my old one, the one Harold and I had bought on our anniversary trip to Vermont, the one with the small dent on the side from when Marcus knocked it off the counter when he was 11 and we laughed about it for years, into a box in the garage without mentioning it. When I found it there a week later, I didn't say anything. I put it back on the shelf next to Harold's toolbox and left it there. Renata was not a loud person. She did not shout. She did not call me names. She was the kind of cruel that wears the costume of helpfulness, and it took me longer than I would like to admit to see through the costume because I kept telling myself that surely she meant well, that surely a woman could not look another woman in the eyes and offer her a glass of water with a smile while systematically dismantling everything that made her feel at home in her own house. But she could. And she did. The water in my garden started to be a problem in the second month. The water bill, Renata explained, was higher than she'd expected. She'd started tracking the household expenses. She had a spreadsheet, she showed it to me, highlighted in colors I didn't ask to understand, and the garden was using more than its share. It was just math, she said. She wasn't asking me to stop gardening, she was just making me aware. She said this while standing in my kitchen in my house, in front of the window that looked out onto the roses I had planted the year Harold was diagnosed. Because gardening was the only thing that kept my hands from shaking during those months, I reduced the watering schedule. The roses suffered that summer. I told myself it was the heat. By the fourth month, Renata had begun answering the door when visitors came. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because I was unavailable, but because she had somehow positioned herself as the person who managed the house, and visitors, neighbors, the woman from my book club, the postal carrier who had known me by name for 15 years, began to relate to her as the primary resident and to me as the person who lived in the back room. My neighbor Dorothy said something to me once, in the careful way that people say things they're not sure they should say. She'd stopped me while I was outside checking the mailbox, and she'd put her hand on my arm and looked at me with the particular expression that people use when they are trying to ask if you are all right without saying those exact words. I told her I was fine. I told her the new arrangement was working well. I said this while looking at my own front door, which now had a wreath on it that Renata had purchased without consulting me, a wreath that was perfectly nice and that I had never chosen. Dorothy squeezed my arm and didn't say anything else. But she looked at me the way people look at someone when they know the answer to the question they just asked was not the true one. Daniel, through all of this, was largely absent. He worked long hours, or said he did. He came home tired and hungry and went to bed early and left before I was awake in the mornings, and the life I had imagined, the two of us having coffee in the kitchen, the gradual rebuilding of the closeness that had been easier when he was young and needed me, did not materialize. What materialized instead was Renata. Renata was always there. Always present. Always managing. I began to notice things. Small things at first. Mail that I expected but hadn't received. My bank statements, which I had always received by post because Harold had set it up that way and I'd never changed it, seemed to have stopped arriving. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he said he could look into it and then didn't. When I mentioned it again, Renata said she'd been collecting the mail and putting it on the hall table and perhaps I'd missed them there. Which could not have been true because I checked the hall table every day, but I said nothing. I started writing things down. Small things, in a notebook that I kept in the inside pocket of the cardigan I wore around the house, a habit I had developed without entirely meaning to, the way you start doing things quietly when something in your body understands there is a reason for quiet before your mind has caught up with it. Dates. Times. Things said and not said. A record of the mail. A record of the conversations that hadn't happened when I had tried to initiate them. The book club was the next thing. Renata had mentioned in passing that my being out on Thursday evenings made dinner complicated, since she liked to cook together with Daniel on that night and I was usually the one who started the oven. She said it so casually, so practically, as if it were simply a logistical observation and not the thing it was, which was a suggestion that I should stop going. I missed one Thursday, then two, and by the time Margaret from the book club called to check on me I had already convinced myself that I had simply been tired, that it was my own choice to stay home, that nobody had told me to do anything. Margaret said to me on the phone, with the directness that had always been her particular gift, "Cecilia, is something wrong at home?" And I said no, of course not, just tired, and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "All right, but you call me if you need anything, you hear me? You call me any time." I said I would. I wrote her number in the notebook. I want to tell you about the money because that is where things became impossible to explain away. Harold and I had saved carefully for decades. Not dramatically, not in the way that wealthy people save, but in the steady, deliberate way of people who had grown up understanding that nothing was guaranteed and that the only real security was the kind you built yourself brick by brick, decision by decision over years. When Harold died, the estate, the house, the savings, the investments passed to me. It was not a complicated arrangement. We had seen a lawyer when the boys were small and updated the documents every few years. Everything was in order. What I did not know, because I had not had occasion to think about it, was that Renata had begun to make inquiries. I found this out because of an envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday from a law firm I did not recognize, addressed to me but already opened, the flap carefully retucked, the way you tuck it when you're hoping no one notices it's been tampered with. Inside was a letter referencing a meeting that had apparently taken place between this firm and a client seeking information about the process of establishing power of attorney for an elderly relative showing signs of cognitive decline. The client's name was not in the letter, but the timing was not lost on me. I sat with that letter for a long time, not because I was afraid or not only because of that. I sat with it because I was trying to understand with the full clear-eyed honesty that I had spent my whole life applying to things that were hard to look at directly, whether I had done something to bring this about. Whether I had been genuinely declining in ways I hadn't noticed. Whether Renata's concern, underneath everything else, might have a legitimate root. But I knew myself. I had always known myself. My mind was clear. My memory was sharp. I drove myself to my medical appointments, took my medications without assistance, managed my own finances or had until the mail started disappearing, and had never not once given a physician or a friend or a neighbor any reason to question my capacity. The letter was not about concern. The letter was about the house. I put the letter back in the envelope and put the envelope in the notebook and went to make myself a cup of tea. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the roses, which were doing better now that I had started watering them again in the early mornings before Renata came downstairs, and I made a decision. Not a loud decision. Not a dramatic one. The kind of decision that doesn't announce itself, that simply settles into you like a stone settling to the bottom of still water. I was not going to be managed out of my own life. My granddaughter Sophie called that evening, the way she did on the first Tuesday of every month, a habit she had established herself without being asked, because Sophie was 24 years old and had inherited Harold's instinct for understanding what people needed without being told. Sophie was Marcus's elder daughter, and she had spent many summers in this house growing up, and she knew the rose bushes by name. She had been the one to name them when she was small, a different name for each color, and she knew which drawer the good scissors were in and how I took my tea and the particular sound my laugh made when something genuinely caught me off guard. She called and I answered and she said, "Grandma, how are you?" And I said, "Fine, sweetheart." And there was a pause and then she said, "No, how are you actually?" I had not told anyone yet. I had been carrying it the way I carried most things, privately, internally, without complaint, which is both a strength and a problem in women of my generation. But Sophie asked in the right way and I was tired and so I told her. Not everything. Enough. The mail. The letter. The gradual, careful shrinking of my world inside my own house. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandma, I'm going to come visit next week." And I said, "You don't need to do that." And she said, "I know I don't need to, I want to." And there is something in my granddaughter's voice when she says I want to that sounds so much like her grandfather that I had to press my hand against my sternum for a moment before I could answer. I said, "All right then. Come on Thursday. I want to tell you about the morning it ended. Not the morning I walked out with $20 in my pocket, that comes later, and I will get to it. I want to tell you about the morning 3 weeks before that, when I woke up earlier than usual and went downstairs before anyone else was awake and stood in my kitchen, with its sage green walls that I had chosen, with its window that faced east so the morning light came in at an angle that turned everything golden, and I understood completely and clearly that I was being played a very long and patient game by a woman who had decided that patience was on her side because she assumed I had fewer years left than she did, and that waiting me out was a viable strategy. I understood this, and I felt something shift in me that I can only describe as the particular calm that comes when you stop being afraid of a thing and start making plans about it instead. I made my tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the notebook, and I began to think. The house was in my name. I knew this because I had signed every document myself and because the deed was in the lockbox in my bedroom closet, the lockbox that only I had the key to, a fact that I had verified quietly when I first began to notice that things were not right. I had a lawyer, Arthur Pennington, who had handled Harold's estate and whom I had known for 22 years, a methodical, unflappable man who returned calls the same day he received them and who had once told me, unprompted, that the most important thing any person could do was to keep their own documents in order and know exactly what they contained. I had an appointment with Arthur in 6 days. I had made it without telling anyone in the house, using the phone in my bedroom with the door closed, which was something I had started doing 3 weeks earlier and which no one had questioned because Renata, to her credit, had not yet installed herself in every corner of my life, only most of them. Sophie was arriving on Thursday. And there was one more thing. One thing that nobody in that house, not Daniel, not Renata, not anyone who had watched me shrink quietly into the small back bedroom and reduce my garden watering and miss my book club meetings, knew about. There was a reason I had been so careful all those years. A reason Harold and I had saved with such specific intention. A reason the investments were structured the way they were, the accounts distributed in a pattern that had been deliberately designed, on the advice of a financial planner we had worked with for 18 years, to be opaque to anyone who wasn't looking in exactly the right places. Harold had grown up poor in the specific way that leaves marks. His father had lost everything twice, once in a bad business deal when Harold was 7, once in a medical crisis when Harold was 16, and the experience had given Harold a particular philosophy about money that he had impressed upon me early in our marriage and that I had taken seriously. You never keep it all in one place, he used to say. You never let anyone see the whole picture at once. Not because you're hiding anything wrong. Because the world is full of people who, when they see a whole picture, will find a way to reach for it. What Renata had seen, when she found the bank statements she'd been intercepting, was a modest savings account. A small monthly pension. The house itself. What she had not seen was the rest. Sophie arrived on Thursday with her overnight bag and a container of the lemon bars she knew I liked, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table. After Renata had gone out, which she did most Thursday afternoons, and Daniel was at work, and I told her the rest of it. All of it. The notebook, the letter, the appointment with Arthur, the things I had been putting in order. Sophie listened with her grandmother's face, the one she'd gotten from Harold's side, the composed, attentive one that gave nothing away while it was absorbing everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Grandma, what do you need from me? Not what should we do? Not what do you want to do? What do you need from me?" The distinction mattered enormously. I told her. She nodded. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, and we stayed like that for a moment, and I thought about Harold, and I thought about the roses, and I thought about the particular shape that certain griefs take when they are not the grief of loss but the grief of betrayal, a sharper thing, a thing with edges that catch and cut and do not dull the way loss eventually does, with time and with intention. Then Sophie said, and I noticed something change in her voice when she said it. A new thread of something running through it, something steady and warm and just the smallest bit fierce. She said, "Grandma, I want you to know something. Marcus knows. I told him last week. He's been making calls." I looked at her. "He's furious," she said quietly. "Absolutely furious. But he's being smart about it. He said to tell you he's following your lead." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "He always was the steadier one." Sophie smiled the way Harold used to smile when something surprised him pleasantly. She said, "He said you'd say something like that." The appointment with Arthur went exactly the way I had hoped it would. He was, as always, unhurried, precise, and without drama. He reviewed what I had brought him, the notebook, the letter, a careful log of the missing mail, several documents I had pulled from the lockbox and photographed before replacing exactly as they had been. He read without interrupting. When he finished, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk and looked at me the way he always looked at clients when he was about to say something important. Like he wanted you to know you had his full attention. He said, "Cecilia, you've been thorough." I said, "I was a teacher for 34 years, Arthur." Thoroughness was the whole job. He almost smiled. Then he got to work. What happened over the following 3 weeks was quiet and invisible and entirely devastating to the plans that Renata had been building, though she did not know it yet. Arthur made calls. Documents were reviewed, updated, and secured in ways that were entirely within my rights as the sole owner of everything that was supposedly at stake. I signed things. I waited. I went home each evening and cooked dinner and ate in my small room at the end of the hallway and said nothing. Renata during this period became more attentive. She had noticed something, not the specifics, I was sure of that, but the change in my atmosphere. The way I had stopped flinching when she made her careful little suggestions about the household. The way I'd begun watering the roses again at the hours that suited me, and not the spreadsheet. Small things. The kind of things that would make a certain type of person anxious without being able to say precisely why. She started asking questions about the house. Not direct ones. She was never direct. Casually, over dinner, She would mention something she'd read about property values in the neighborhood, or drop a comment about how much the house would benefit from certain renovations. Once she said, almost to herself, that it would make sense to put Daniel's name on the deed, easier for logistics, she said, just for practical purposes. And I looked at her over the table and said, I'll think about it, in the tone of voice that means I have already thought about it and the answer is no. And something in my tone made her go quiet for the rest of the meal. Daniel noticed none of this. Daniel was, I had come to understand, a kind man who had married a woman who was smarter than he was in the specific ways that advantage women who want to be smarter than the men they are married to. And he had been slowly convinced over years that Renata's version of reality was the reliable one and his own observations were secondary. I did not blame him for this entirely. I understood how it happened. I had watched it happen from inside the house. But understanding how something happened does not mean you are required to accept its consequences. The morning Renata tucked the $20 into my pocket began like any other morning in that house. I had come downstairs to find her already in the kitchen, which was unusual for a Saturday. She was dressed, not in her weekend clothes but in something more deliberate, pressed slacks, a blouse I'd seen her wear to meetings. She had her phone on the counter and she had been, I was fairly certain, in the middle of a call when she heard my footsteps on the stairs. She put the phone face down on the counter. She said, "Good morning," with the particular brightness that I had learned to read as performance. I said, "Good morning," and poured myself a cup of coffee. The conversation that followed was so precisely constructed that I have replayed it many times in the months since, looking for the exact place where the curtain slipped. She began with something practical, a concern about the guest room, which I had been using for a small writing desk and my books. A friend was coming to stay, she explained, just for a few days. She needed the room. I said, "That's my room, Renata." She said, "Of course, but the small bedroom is fine for your things, isn't it? There's really no reason to have a whole extra room just for reading." I looked at her. I said, "Renata, I want to be clear about something." She smiled. It was a smile I had come to recognize, the one she used when she believed she was about to manage something. She said, "I just think it would be easier for everyone." I said, "I believe you do think that." And then she said it. The thing that I think she had been building toward for months, the conclusion of a very long and patient project, delivered in the brisk, practical tone of someone who has decided the time for politeness is over. She reached into her own pocket and produced the $20. It was already folded, which told me she had prepared it in advance, which told me everything about how premeditated this moment was. And she stepped forward and tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan with the efficiency of someone completing a transaction. She said, "There's a shelter on Millbrook. They take walk-ins. You'd be comfortable there. Don't come back." She said it in the voice of someone who believes they are holding all the cards. She did not know what I had done over the past 3 weeks. She did not know about Arthur, about the calls Marcus had been making, about the particular morning 2 weeks earlier when I had sat at Arthur's desk and signed a single document that rearranged, with elegant and total completeness, every financial thing she thought she understood about my situation. She did not know about the bus I was about to take, and the one stop I had been planning to make. I stood in the foyer of my house for what I knew would be the last time for a while. I looked at the wreath on the front door, Renata's wreath, with its artificial leaves and its little bow. I thought about taking it down. I decided to leave it. I put on my coat. I said, "All right then." And I walked out. The $20 was still in my pocket. I did not need it for what I was about to do. But I kept it there because I thought it might be useful to remember later, to have the physical weight of it as a reminder of the moment when someone had looked at 72 years of a life and decided it was worth exactly $20 and an address for a shelter. The bus stop was half a block from the house. The number 14 ran every 20 minutes. I knew the schedule because I had been taking the 14 for 30 years, to and from the library, to the farmer's market on Saturdays, to the garden center in the spring when my car was in the shop and I'd had to manage without it and had discovered, to my surprise and pleasure, that I preferred the bus. You see things from a bus that you miss from a car. You are forced to be present in a way that driving does not require. I sat by the window and watched the neighborhood go by. The coffee shop on the corner where Harold and I used to go on Sunday mornings. The park where I had pushed 2 strollers in my time and then later pushed a different kind. Sophie's when she was small and Marcus and his wife needed a weekend of sleep. The library, its brick face exactly the same as it had always been. Its small garden out front just beginning to show the first tentative green of the season. I got off at my stop. Not the shelter on Millbrook. The other stop. The one Renata didn't know about. The building I walked into had a glass lobby and a receptionist who knew my name. She smiled when I came in and said, "Mrs. Voss, he's expecting you," and I said thank you and took the elevator to the 4th floor and walked down a hallway I had walked down many times over the past 3 weeks and knocked on the door at the end of it. Arthur Pennington opened the door. Beside him stood Marcus, who had flown in that morning from Portland. And beside Marcus stood a woman I had not met before, Arthur's colleague. He had explained when he described her, a specialist in elder law and financial fraud, a person of formidable professional reputation who had, upon hearing the broad outlines of my situation, apparently said without hesitation that she would be glad to help. Marcus looked at me the way he had looked at me at Harold's grave, with his whole face, nothing held back. He said, "Mom." I said, "Don't cry in the lobby, Marcus, it'll embarrass Arthur." Arthur made a sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed quickly. We went inside and sat down. And I put $20 on the table and I said, "I want to show you all something because I think it will help you understand the kind of person we're dealing with, and I think understanding that is going to matter quite a lot for what we do next." They looked at the bill. They looked at me. I said she thought this was the end of the story. I paused. I said, "It isn't." Outside the window, the city moved and breathed in its ordinary way, entirely unaware that in a 4th-floor office on a Tuesday morning, a woman who had been handed $20 and told not to come back was sitting very straight in a good chair, with her son on one side of her and her lawyer on the other, and was beginning, with a clarity and a patience and a particular quality of quiet that she had spent a lifetime developing, to take apart everything that someone else had spent months building, piece by piece, in the right order, without raising her voice once. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. Arthur had a way of beginning difficult conversations that I had always found reassuring. He did not rush toward the hard thing. He laid out the table first, the documents, the timeline, the structure of what existed and what had been changed and what was now, as of 3 weeks of careful, quiet work, beyond anyone's reach but mine. He did so in the unhurried voice of a man who understood that clarity was its own form of power, and that panic was the enemy of good decisions. Marcus sat beside me and said nothing for the first several minutes. He had always been a listener before he was a speaker, which was one of the things Harold had loved about him. Harold used to say that the most underrated skill in any room was the ability to hear what was actually being said rather than what you expected to hear, and Marcus had inherited that skill along with Harold's jawline and his tendency to go very still when something mattered. The specialist, her name was Dr. Linda Beaumont, and she had the kind of professional stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where people are frightened and need not to feel frightened, sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and a pen and made notes in a handwriting so small and precise that I found myself wondering briefly and absurdly whether she had been a teacher in a former life. Arthur began with the house. The house, he explained, was and had always been solely in my name. Harold's name had been removed at his request when he was first diagnosed, because Harold had understood, with the practical clarity that had defined him, that medical costs could be unpredictable and that the house needed to be protected. This was not an unusual arrangement. It was, Arthur said, a sensible one, and it meant that no action involving the house, no transfer of title, no use as collateral, no legal claim of any kind, could be initiated without my explicit, witnessed, legally documented consent. The efforts that had been made to establish a record of my cognitive decline, the letter from the law firm, which Arthur had now traced to a specific attorney who had been retained by Renata without Daniel's knowledge, a detail that would matter, were premature in a very specific legal sense. The process they had been attempting to begin required a medical evaluation by an independent physician, a formal court petition, and a hearing before a judge. None of those things had happened. What had happened was a great deal of groundwork. The missing mail, the intercepted bank statements, the careful construction of a narrative about a declining old woman, without any of the legal steps that would have been required to act on that groundwork. They had built a stage. They had not yet been able to perform on it. Dr. Beaumont looked up from her legal pad at this point and said, in the tone of someone reporting the weather, that what had occurred constituted financial elder abuse under state law, that the specific actions taken, the opened mail, the intercepted statements, the retained attorney working toward guardianship without the knowledge or consent of the person whose guardianship was being sought, were actionable, and that she had, in the course of her career, seen situations considerably less clear-cut than this one result in significant legal consequences for the people who had initiated them. Marcus exhaled. A long, carefully controlled exhale, the kind that contains something much louder inside it. I said, I want to understand the full picture before we decide anything. Dr. Beaumont said, of course, and returned to her notes. Arthur continued. The investment accounts, the ones that existed in the arrangement Harold had insisted upon, distributed and structured and deliberately opaque to anyone who didn't know where to look, were intact. Renata had not found them. I knew she hadn't found them because Arthur had spent the past 3 weeks verifying that no inquiries had been made, no access attempted, no paperwork filed that referenced them. She had been working from an incomplete picture, which meant her entire plan was built on an incomplete foundation. I thought about Harold, about the particular satisfaction he would have taken in this. He had never been a vengeful man, but he had believed, deeply and practically, that the best protection against the kind of people who would take advantage of trust was to make sure that trust was never the only thing standing between you and your security. He had built that protection into every structure of our financial life, and it had held, and he was not alive to see it hold, and I felt his absence in that moment as a specific and precise ache that was also somehow something close to comfort. I said, tell me about Daniel. Arthur and Marcus exchanged a look. It was a brief look, the kind that carries a conversation compressed into a fraction of a second. Then Marcus turned to me and said, Mom, from what we can determine, Daniel doesn't know the full extent of what Renata has been doing. I had suspected this. I had not wanted to believe it exactly, but I had suspected it, because there is a difference between a person who participates in cruelty and a person who is positioned carefully alongside it so that they absorb some of the warmth of the plan without understanding all of its implications. Daniel was not a brave person. He never had been. He was a man who found the path of least resistance and followed it with great diligence, and for a long time the path of least resistance had been to believe whatever Renata told him, and to not look too closely at the spaces between her words. But that was different from knowing. And it mattered because what happened next was going to affect Daniel as well, and I did not want to destroy my son if I could avoid destroying him. Marcus said, the attorney Renata retained, without Daniel's knowledge as far as we can tell, filed the initial inquiry about 3 months ago. Arthur has the documentation. Daniel's name was not on anything. I said, she did it without telling him. Arthur said, it appears so. I sat with that for a moment. Renata had been running her own operation, inside the marriage, using the cover of the marriage, without Daniel as a full partner in it. She had managed him the way she managed everything, carefully, with just enough information to keep him cooperative, and not enough to make him complicit in anything that would make him object. She was, I thought, genuinely quite intelligent. In a different world, in a different life, pointed in a different direction, she might have been impressive. I said, what do we do first? Dr. Beaumont set down her pen. She said, the most important thing you've already done, which is to secure everything before anyone could move on it. What comes next depends on what outcome you want. There are several paths and they have different consequences for different people. I said, walk me through them. She did. Took about 40 minutes. I listened to all of it and I asked questions and I made notes in my own notebook, the small one that had started as a record of missing mail and had become something else entirely over the past weeks. Marcus sat beside me and occasionally asked a question himself, and Arthur answered all of them in his methodical, unhurried way. By the time we finished, I had a very clear picture of what was possible and what I wanted to do. I did not want to do the loudest thing. I never have. I wanted to do the thing that was accurate, that matched precisely and without excess, the shape and size of what had been done to me. I was not interested in drama for its own sake. I was interested in the house being mine, in my finances being secure, in the narrative that had been constructed about my declining mind being dismantled publicly and permanently, and in the person who had spent 7 months quietly erasing me from my own life, understanding, in full and without ambiguity, that the erasure had not worked. And there was one more thing I wanted. It was the thing I had been most careful about. The thing that nobody in that meeting room knew about yet because I had not told anyone except Sophie, and Sophie had held it the way she held everything, with complete reliability and zero drama. I had not been entirely idle during those 7 months. I want to explain something about the way I had spent my time in the small back bedroom at the end of the hallway, in the house that was mine but no longer felt like mine. I want to explain it because I think it matters and because I think the people who watched me shrinking Renata, and to some extent Daniel and perhaps even some neighbors who saw me less and less on the street, believed that what they were observing was a woman becoming smaller, diminishing, fading in the particular way that the people who want you to fade are waiting for. What I was actually doing was thinking. I have always been a thinker. Harold used to say that I thought more thoroughly about a thing in 10 minutes of quiet than most people managed in a week of conversation, and that this had made me, across our marriage, both his greatest asset and occasionally his greatest challenge, because thinking thoroughly about things has a way of leading you to conclusions that people who haven't done the same thinking find unexpected. I had spent 43 years with a man who respected that quality in me, and I had spent 7 months with a woman who had read it as passivity. She had watched me go quiet and mistaken the quiet for surrender. In the small back bedroom in the evenings after dinner, with the door closed and my notebook open, I had been going through papers. Harold's papers primarily, the documents that had been in the lockbox, which I had been reviewing and reorganizing with a focus and deliberateness that I think would have surprised people who had concluded I was confused. And in the course of reviewing those papers, I had found something that I had known about in a general way but had not thought about in years, because there had been no reason to think about it while Harold was alive and while everything was ordered and while the question of what I would do if things ever became genuinely precarious was still theoretical. Harold, 18 years ago, had purchased a property. Not a large property. Not anything dramatic. A small 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood about 4 miles from where we lived, which he had bought as an investment and which had been renting steadily to a series of quiet, reliable tenants ever since, managed through a property management company that deposited the rent income directly into one of the accounts that Renata had not found. Harold had set this up with the deliberateness he applied to everything, and he had mentioned it to me in the way you mention a thing you consider settled, briefly, practically, without ceremony. He had also mentioned at the time that we should discuss what I wanted to do with it if anything happened to him. We had not had that discussion before he died. But the property was there, and it was mine, and it was currently occupied by a tenant whose lease expired in 6 weeks. I had called the property management company from my bedroom 2 weeks earlier, with the door closed, and I had asked a number of questions. Sophie was the only person I had told. She had listened and then she had said, "Grandma, that's where you're going to go, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. I had said it's where I was always going to go once I knew I needed to. In Arthur's office, after we had finished discussing the legal strategy, I told them about the property. Arthur did not look surprised. Arthur almost never looked surprised, which was one of the things I valued about him. But Marcus turned to look at me with an expression that was equal parts relief and something that might have been wonder. He said, "You knew about that house?" I said, "Your father and I bought it together." He said, "I didn't know." I said, "You didn't need to know at the time. Now you do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, why didn't you go there immediately? When things started getting bad, why didn't you just—" I said, "Because I needed to understand the full picture first. Because leaving without understanding would have meant leaving without protecting everything that needed protecting. And because—" I paused here, not for effect but because the next part was the truest and therefore required the most care. Because I had spent your father's whole illness and the whole of the time after it trying to make sure everything was in order. And I was not going to walk out of that house until I was certain that walking out was the last step of a complete plan, not the first step of a panicked one." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered my hand with his, exactly the way Sophie had. And I thought about how children carry their parents into the world in ways they don't know and can't see, and how this is one of the more beautiful things about human beings. He said, "Dad would have been proud of you." I said, "Your father was a practical man. He would have been proud that it worked." Dr. Beaumont made a small sound that I think was a suppressed laugh. She covered it professionally. We spent another hour in that office, going through the specific sequence of what would happen next. There were letters to be sent, formal legal letters, the kind that make people understand that the conversation they believe they were having has been replaced, without warning, by a different and considerably more serious one. There were notifications to be filed. There was a process, unhurried but implacable, that was going to move forward with or without anyone's cooperation, and that cooperation would only determine how smoothly it moved, not whether it moved at all. I signed what needed to be signed. I shook Dr. Beaumont's hand and thanked her. I told Arthur I would call him Thursday. Then Marcus and I went to lunch at a small Italian place 2 blocks from the office, a place I had been going to for years because they made a particular mushroom risotto that Harold had loved, and we sat across from each other at a corner table and ordered the risotto and talked about his daughters and his wife and the house in Portland, and whether the roses were going to need to be cut back before I replanted the garden, and the $20 sat in my pocket the whole time, and I thought about what was happening on the other side of the city, in the house I had left that morning, where a woman who believed she had just won was beginning to understand, in the way you begin to understand things before you fully understand them, that the ground was not entirely solid. Renata would have tried to call me. I had turned off my phone that morning, which was something I had never done before in my adult life. I was a person who believed in being reachable because you never knew when someone might need you, but I had done it deliberately and without guilt because there are times when being unreachable is itself the message, and this was one of those times. When I turned the phone back on after lunch, there were 11 missed calls. 4 from Renata, 3 from Daniel, 2 from a number I didn't recognize, 1 from Sophie with a text that said simply, "I heard. Call me when you're ready," and 1 from Margaret from the book club, which struck me as both unlikely and somehow perfectly appropriate, because Margaret had always had an instinct for exactly the right moment to reach out. I called Sophie first. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm having risotto." She said, "Grandma." I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm with Marcus. Everything is moving the way it should." She exhaled. She said, "I talked to Dad this morning. She paused. He knows something is wrong." Renata called him and she was apparently very upset, and he could tell there was something she wasn't telling him, and he called me. She paused again. "He doesn't know everything. He knows something has changed and he knows you're not in the house and she chose the word carefully. "He's worried." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you want me to tell him?" I considered this. There was a version of the answer that was punitive, a version that left Daniel suspended in uncertainty for longer than necessary. As a consequence of the uncertainty he had allowed me to inhabit for 7 months. I could feel the appeal of that version, but the appeal of it was not, ultimately, the thing I wanted to be guided by. I said, "Tell him to call me tonight. Tell him I'll explain what I can." Sophie said, "Okay." "And Grandma?" She said this in a different tone, lower, more private. "I want you to know that I'm glad you did this. I'm glad you had a plan." I kept thinking the last few months, every time we talked, I kept thinking I should say something, do something, but you always seemed so calm and I didn't know if I was misreading it, and now I know you were just, I said, "I was thinking." She said, "I was going to say you were being you." I said, "Same thing." She laughed. It sounded like Harold. Marcus drove me to the property that afternoon. It was a drive of 20 minutes through the city, through neighborhoods that shifted gradually from commercial to residential, past a park I had walked Harold through once when his treatments were making him tired and we had needed to go slowly, and he had said out of nowhere that this was his favorite kind of afternoon, the kind where you went slowly and looked at things, and I had said we should do this more often, and he had said yes, and we had both known without saying it that the opportunities to do it more often were more limited than we wanted them to be. The house was a small 2-bedroom with a front porch and a backyard that needed attention. The previous tenant had kept it clean but had not gardened, and the beds were bare and waiting. The management company had arranged for the key to be left for me, and when I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I stood in the small entryway for a moment and breathed. It smelled like other people's living, clean but layered. The particular smell of a house that has had many tenants and absorbed all of them a little without belonging to any of them. It was a house waiting to become someone's. Marcus stood beside me. He said, "It's nice, Mom." I said, "It needs a rug in the hallway." Harold always said the hallway was where a house introduced itself. Marcus said, "We can get a rug." I said, "I know. I'll find the right one." We walked through the rooms together. The kitchen was smaller than the one I'd left that morning but faced south, which meant good light, which was what mattered. The bedroom had 2 windows and a closet that was frankly larger than I needed. The backyard was, as I had suspected, a blank canvas of the most hopeful kind. I stood at the back door and looked at the yard. Marcus said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm thinking about where to put the roses." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll help you move them. Whatever you want to bring. I'll come back next weekend and we'll move whatever you need." I said, "The roses will need to be divided first. You can't just move them all at once, you have to be careful about it." He said, "I know." I've watched you do it. I turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway, his father's face, his father's way of holding himself when something mattered. Very still, very present. I said, "You have your father's patience." He said, "I got it from both of you." We stood there for a moment in the house that was about to become mine, in the afternoon light coming through the south-facing kitchen window, and then Marcus said he needed to make a call and stepped back inside. And I stayed at the back door and looked at the yard and began, very quietly and with great deliberateness, to plan the garden. It was 3 days later that the letters arrived. Not at the small house on the south side. Nobody knew that address yet, except Sophie and Marcus and Arthur and the property management company. The letters went to the house on Fernwood Drive, the house with the wreath on the door and the sage green kitchen and the roses that were still, as far as I knew, being denied the water they needed. Renata received her letter on a Thursday morning. Arthur's office had timed it deliberately. Thursday mornings, he had noted from the details I had shared with him over our weeks of preparation, was when Renata typically had the house to herself. I know what was in the letter because Arthur drafted it in front of me and read it back to me twice to confirm every word. It was not a long letter. Did not need to be. It identified, in precise legal language that required no interpretation, that the property at the address she currently occupied was the sole property of Cecilia Margaret Voss, that any claim to that property or to any associated financial assets was without legal foundation, that certain actions taken in recent months constituted financial elder abuse under applicable state statutes, that documentation of those actions was in the possession of the legal firm, whose letterhead appeared at the top of the page, and that Mrs. Voss was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies unless a satisfactory resolution was reached within 30 days. There was a second letter, somewhat gentler in tone, addressed to Daniel. I had written that one myself at Arthur's kitchen table, and he had reviewed it and said only that it was clear and that it said what it needed to say. I had told Daniel in that letter that I loved him, that I understood that he had been in a position that was more complicated than it appeared from the outside, and that I was not interested in punishing him but that I was also not willing to pretend that nothing had happened. I told him that what happened next was going to depend in part on choices he made, and that I hoped he would make good ones. I told him I would be available to speak to him when he was ready to have an honest conversation. I did not tell him where I was. Daniel called that evening. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, not because I was being strategic but because I needed 3 rings to prepare myself for the sound of his voice, which was always going to be complicated regardless of what he had allowed to happen. He said, "Mom." I said, "Hello, Daniel." There was a long pause. Long enough that I thought for a moment the call might have dropped. Then he said, "I didn't know. About the lawyer she hired. About what she was trying to do. I swear to you I didn't know." I said, "I believe you." Another pause. He said, "Where are you?" I said, "Somewhere safe." He said, "Mom," I said, "Daniel, I don't want to do this on the phone. When you're ready to talk face to face, you'll call Marcus and he'll arrange it. That's how this is going to work." He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too," in the broken voice of a man who is beginning to understand the full weight of what he permitted to happen, and I ended the call and sat for a while in the kitchen of the small house and let the feeling move through me without trying to name it, because some feelings don't have names, or rather they have too many. The thing I had not told anyone, the thing that was not in any of the letters, not in any of the legal documents, not in any of the conversations I had had in Arthur's office or over the phone with Marcus or over lunch with Sophie, was what I had understood, during those 7 months in the small back bedroom, about the specific nature of what Renata had been trying to do. She had not only been trying to take the house. She had been trying to take the version of me that existed in the world. The version that people knew and trusted and called by name and thought of when they thought of competence and dignity, and the particular kind of reliability that comes from a person who has spent their life showing up and doing the hard thing without complaint. She had been building a different version, a confused, declining, unreliable version, and she had been building it carefully brick by brick, in the minds of the people around me. The doctor who had heard her accounts of my forgetfulness. The neighbors who had noticed me less and less. The friends from the book club who had stopped receiving my calls. That version of me was a lie. And the lie needed to be corrected not just in a courtroom but in the world. This was the part of the plan I had not yet explained to Arthur or to Marcus or to Dr. Beaumont. Not because I was hiding it but because I was still working out the precise shape of it. It was going to require a different kind of move than the legal ones, Something more personal, more visible, more targeted. Something that would undo the work she had done in the way that such work can only be undone, which is by being seen by the same people who had absorbed the original false impression. I had a list in my notebook. The people who needed to hear from me directly. Dorothy, who had squeezed my arm at the mailbox and looked at me with that careful expression. My doctor, whose medical notes had been quietly shaped by Renata's narratives over months of appointments. Margaret from the book club, who had been the first to notice something was wrong, and who had been patient about it in the way of someone who is waiting to be needed. The postal carrier who had started routing my mail through the house rather than directly to me, because that was the arrangement that had been quietly established without my knowledge. I had a list, and I had time. I was not going anywhere. I was not recovering from anything. I was 72 years old, in full possession of my mind and my health and my considerable patience, and I was sitting in a kitchen that faced south, in a house that had a yard that needed a garden, and I had all the time in the world to do this correctly. The $20 was on the counter beside me. I had taken it out of my pocket that first afternoon after Marcus left, and set it on the counter where I could see it. I looked at it sometimes while I was thinking. It was the most clarifying $20 I had ever encountered. Every time I looked at it, I felt the same thing I had felt in the foyer of the house on Fernwood Drive. Not anger, or not primarily anger, but a kind of crystalline focus that I recognized as the feeling I had always had when I understood exactly what needed to be done and was ready to do it. Sophie came to visit that first Saturday. She arrived with lemon bars and a truck, a small rented truck, which she had not mentioned she was bringing, and which contained, in addition to Sophie herself, a carefully packed selection of things she had apparently retrieved from the house on Fernwood Drive in my absence, using a key she had quietly obtained from Marcus, who had quietly obtained it from a copy that had always existed in Arthur's records. From the truck she produced 3 of my good rugs, my cookware, including the coffee maker from Vermont that had been in a box in the garage, 4 boxes of books, 2 bags of garden tools, a framed photograph of Harold and me on our 30th anniversary, which had been on the mantel in the living room until Renata had moved it to a shelf in the garage, along with several other things she had judged decoratively incompatible with her vision for the space. And the last thing Sophie carried up the porch steps very carefully, wrapped in a damp cloth and seated in a plastic container of soil, was a rose. A single cane from the garden, properly divided and ready for transplanting. She held it out to me and said, "I thought you'd want to start." I took it. I looked at it. It was from the deep red bush near the back fence, the one I had planted the spring Harold was diagnosed, the one Sophie had named Courage when she was 7 years old because it was the bravest color she had ever seen. I said, "You remembered the name." She said, "I remember everything you taught me, Grandma." We planted it together in the corner of the south-facing yard where the light would be best, and Sophie got soil on her knees and didn't care. And I knelt beside her and felt the particular quality of the earth in my hands that I had been missing for 7 months without entirely knowing I was missing it. And when we were done we stood back and looked at it and Sophie said, "The others will come." I said, "Yes, they will." She said, "And this is just the beginning." I said, "I know. And I'm not in a hurry." She looked at me sideways. She said, "You never are." I said, "It's the only way to do anything correctly." She laughed and I laughed, and in the late afternoon light of the small yard that was beginning to be mine, with a rose called Courage in the corner and a kitchen that faced south and a plan that was already quietly, implacably in motion, in that specific moment, standing in the dirt with my granddaughter, I was not a woman who had been handed $20 and told not to come back. I was a woman who had taken the bus to one secret stop. And everything that happened next was going to follow from that. The first call I made on Monday morning was to my doctor. Not to schedule an appointment, though I would do that eventually. I called to speak to him directly, which required some persistence with the front desk but which I had expected and prepared for, because I had been a patient of Dr. Raymond Okafor for 14 years and I knew that his first available appointment was always 3 weeks out, but that he picked up his own line between 8 and 8:30 in the morning when he was reviewing files before the day began. Harold had discovered this accidentally and told me, and I had filed it away in the particular way I filed useful information, without fanfare, in a place I could retrieve it when it mattered. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Raymond, this is Cecilia Voss." He said, "Cecilia, what a surprise. Is everything all right?" I said, "That depends on how you define all right. I need to talk to you about something and I need to do it before your next set of notes about me is written, because there is information in my recent file that I believe is inaccurate and I think you should know where it came from." There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that means a person is shifting from one mode of attention to another. He said, "Come in this week. Thursday 8:15. I'll make it work." I said, "Thank you. I'll be there." I put the phone down and wrote Thursday 8:15, Dr. Okafor in my notebook, then made a second note beside it. Bring the record of symptoms from the past 6 months, the one I had compiled from memory and from the notes Renata had made in the margins of a pad she'd left on the kitchen counter, which I had photographed quietly one evening while she was upstairs, because the notes described symptoms that I did not have and conversations that had not happened, and they were written in the particular hand of someone who was building a document for a purpose. I had brought copies of those photographs to Arthur's office. He had looked at them without expression and made a note on his own legal pad and said, "Useful." The second call was to Margaret. Margaret answered before the second ring was finished, which told me she had been waiting for the call without knowing she was waiting for it, which was very much like Margaret. She said, "Cecilia, it's been too long." I said, "It has, and I owe you an explanation." She said, "You don't owe me anything." I said, "I'd like to give you one anyway. Can we have lunch this week?" She said, "Tuesday, 12:30. The place on Harbor Street where they do the good clam chowder." I said, "Perfect." She said, "And Cecilia, I'm glad you called." I said, "I'm glad I can." There was something in her voice when she said goodbye that told me she had been worried and was relieved and was managing both of those things with the brisk efficiency she applied to everything. Margaret had been my friend for 26 years. She had known Harold. She had been at the funeral. She had called me every week for the first 6 months after he died on no particular day, just whenever she felt like calling, which was the exact right approach for that period because the predictability of scheduled calls had sometimes felt like one more thing to manage, and Margaret somehow knew that without being told. I had missed her. I had not known how much until I was making plans to see her. The third call was the one that required the most preparation, and it was the one I had been turning over in my mind since I had made the list in the notebook, sitting in the kitchen of the small house on that first evening. I called Dorothy. Dorothy lived 3 houses down from the house on Fernwood Drive, the house I had left 11 days earlier with $20 in my pocket. She was 76, a retired librarian, a woman of considerable precision and enormous warmth, and she had stood at my mailbox and squeezed my arm with an expression that I now understood had been the expression of someone who saw something happening and did not know how to say so without overstepping. She answered on the 4th ring, slightly breathless, as if she had been moving when the phone rang and had hurried to catch it. I said, "Dorothy, it's Cecilia." She said, "Oh, Cecilia," and the relief in her voice was immediate and total and told me everything about how worried she had been. I said, "I'm all right. I'm safe. I'm calling because I owe you a conversation." She said, "You don't owe me anything." I said, "Everyone seems to be telling me that this week." She laughed, a slightly watery laugh, and said, "Where are you?" I said, "Somewhere comfortable. I'll explain when I see you. Can you come for tea?" She said, "Tell me when." I said, "Wednesday 3 o'clock. I'll text you the address." She said yes so quickly that I thought she might have been waiting by the door. I made 3 more calls that morning and sent 2 letters, one of them handwritten because there was a particular person on my list who I knew would understand the significance of handwriting in an age when nobody wrote letters anymore, and who would read it more carefully as a result. Then I made a pot of the coffee from the Vermont machine, which produced a slightly dented but entirely reliable cup, and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the yard through the south-facing window and thought about the sequence of what was coming. Arthur had told me, at our Thursday call, that Renata's attorney had responded to the letter. The response had been, in Arthur's words, the response of someone who has just realized they have significantly miscalculated. There had been a suggestion of misunderstanding, a request for a meeting, a carefully worded indication that perhaps certain actions had been taken without full consideration of all relevant circumstances. Arthur had responded with a document outlining, in precise and unhurried detail, every relevant circumstance, and had indicated that Mrs. Voss was available to discuss a resolution but that the terms of that resolution were not negotiable. Renata had called Daniel 3 times in the 2 days following the letter. Marcus had told me this with the slightly careful tone he used when he was sharing information he thought might be painful. I had said, "I know," and he had said, "You know she called him?" And I had said, "I know she would call him. He is the only remaining option she has for a sympathetic ear, and even he is running out of sympathy." This turned out to be accurate. Daniel called me on the Wednesday before I was expecting him to. He had called Marcus first as I had instructed, and Marcus had arranged it, and when Daniel's voice came through the phone it had a quality I had not heard in it for years, stripped of the careful managed neutrality he had been performing since Renata arrived in his life, sounding instead simply young. Not young in years, he was 44, but young in the way that people sound when they have had something stripped away that they were using as a buffer between themselves and their own discomfort. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I said, "All right." He said, "Renata has been," he stopped. Started again. "There are things she did that I'm only now understanding the full picture of. The lawyer she hired. The mail." He stopped again. I knew something was off. I could feel it. But she had explanations for everything, and I wanted to believe the explanations, and His voice broke slightly, then steadied. "I didn't look hard enough. I chose not to look hard enough, and that's not the same as not knowing, and I want you to know that I understand the difference." I was quiet for a moment. This was not the conversation I had expected to have this week. I had expected it later, with more distance on both sides. But Daniel was ready for it now, which meant I needed to be ready for it too, and I was, or I would be, because I had been preparing for it in the background of all the other preparations. I said, "Daniel, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." He said, "Okay." I said, "Did you know she had retained a lawyer to begin the process of establishing guardianship over me?" He said, "No." "I swear to you, Mom, I didn't know. When Arthur's letter came and I read it, He paused and I could hear him managing something. I felt sick. I confronted her and she told me it was for my protection, for our protection, that she was just exploring options, that I was overreacting. But I've seen the documents now. Arthur sent me copies and I've read them, and there is no version of what she was doing that is protecting anyone except herself." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm so sorry." I did not rush to say it was all right, because it was not entirely all right, and I believe that dishonest comfort is one of the most corrosive things you can offer another person. I said, "I know you are. I believe that you are. And I believe that you didn't know the full extent of it, but I also need you to sit with the part that you did permit, the small erasures, Daniel, the kitchen, the mail, the way she spoke to me in my own house. Those things happened in front of you, and you told yourself they were minor, and I need you to understand that minor is not the same as harmless." There was a long silence. He said, "I know." I said, "Good. Sit with that." Another silence. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Right now? Nothing immediate. Eventually a real conversation in person, and a genuine accounting of what happened. Not for my sake only but for yours, because you are going to carry this differently depending on whether you face it or don't." He said, "I understand." I said, "I love you, Daniel." He said, "I love you too, Mom. And I'm going to be better." I said, "I know you're going to try. That's enough for now." I put the phone down and sat for a while and let myself feel the full complexity of what it means to love a child who has disappointed you in a serious way, and to still love them regardless, and to hold both of those things simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other. It is, I have found, one of the harder things. Not impossible. Just hard. Dorothy arrived on Wednesday at 3 o'clock with a tin of shortbread and a determined expression, the kind that meant she had been rehearsing what she wanted to say on the walkover, and was going to say it whether the moment felt right or not. I let her in and made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she looked around the small house with the careful attention of someone cataloging their impressions, and then she looked at me. She said, "You look better." I said, "I feel better." She said, "When did you move here?" I said, 11 days ago. She said, "Cecilia, I have to tell you something, and I need you to know that I am saying it because I am your friend and because I have been worrying about it for months and because I should have said it sooner and I'm sorry I didn't." I said, "Tell me." She said, "That woman in your house. I watched what she was doing to you. I watched you disappear one piece at a time, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my business and you would say something if you needed help, and I kept almost saying something and then not saying it, and I am ashamed of that. I should have said something much sooner." I said, "Dorothy." She said, "I'm serious. You were my neighbor and my friend, and I watched her take the garden from you and I said nothing." I said, "You squeezed my arm at the mailbox." She said, "That's not enough." I said, "It was more than you know. It reminded me that someone was paying attention, and that mattered." She looked at me with the precision of a woman who spent 40 years as a librarian, and knows when someone is being diplomatic. Then she said, "Is there anything I can do now?" I said, "As a matter of fact, yes. I'd like to tell you what happened, all of it, and I'd like you to know the truth because what's been happening in that house over the past 7 months is going to have a conclusion that people in the neighborhood are going to hear about, and I want you to have the accurate version so that when you hear the other version you'll know what it is. Dorothy set down her teacup. She said, "Tell me everything." I did. Took about an hour. Dorothy listened without interrupting, which was a considerable exercise in self-restraint on her part because she was not a woman who usually withheld her opinions, but she held them until I finished and then she let them out in a controlled but unmistakable stream that covered Renata's character, the general category of people who behave as Renata had behaved, the specific failure of society to take elder financial abuse seriously enough, and the question of why on earth Arthur had not sent that letter 6 months earlier. I explained that Arthur had sent the letter at the earliest possible moment, which was the moment when everything was in order and the position was unassailable. Dorothy said, "Well, all right then." She picked up her shortbread. She said, "What happens next?" I said, "The legal process moves forward. Arthur's office is filing a formal complaint with the state attorney's office regarding the financial fraud. Renata has 30 days to respond to the terms of the resolution agreement. Daniel is separately in the process of reconsidering a number of things about his life." Dorothy said, "And the house? Your house on Fernwood?" I said, "It remains mine. Entirely legally, without question mine. Renata will be vacating it within the month. Daniel may stay temporarily while he figures out his situation, or he may not. That is his choice to make." Dorothy said, "And you? Will you go back?" I looked around the kitchen. I looked at the south-facing window and the yard beyond it where courage was already beginning to establish itself in the corner with the best light. I thought about the hallway rug I had found at a shop on Tuesday, a deep green one with a pattern that reminded me of the hills where I grew up, which was now in the entryway of this small house, greeting everyone who came in with exactly the right introduction. I said, "I don't think so. I think this house suits me better." Dorothy said, "It does. You look like yourself here." I said, "I feel like myself here." She nodded. She picked up another piece of shortbread and said, "Good. Now tell me about the garden because I can see from here that the back bed needs complete reworking and I have opinions." I laughed. It was the first genuinely free laugh I had had in 7 months, the kind that comes from the whole chest, the kind Harold used to say was the best sound in any room. Lunch with Margaret on Thursday was longer than either of us planned. We arrived at 12:30 and left at almost 4. Having moved from the clam chowder through 2 pots of tea and a shared piece of apple cake that neither of us had intended to order but that arrived at the table courtesy of the proprietor, who had known Margaret for 20 years and seemed to understand that something significant was being discussed. I told her what I had told Dorothy more or less. Margaret listened with the focused attention she had always brought to everything. She had been a high school English teacher before she retired, and she had the same quality of listening that the best teachers have, which is the quality of hearing what you're actually saying rather than waiting for the parts that confirm what you already think. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to come back to the book club." I said, "I'd like that." She said, "Next month we're doing the new one everyone's talking about, and I have thoughts and I've been saving them for you specifically because you're the only one in the group who will fight me on them properly." I said, "What position are you taking?" She told me. I immediately disagreed with approximately half of it. We argued about the book for 45 minutes and it was the most alive I had felt in longer than I wanted to calculate. When we finally stood to leave, Margaret put on her coat and then stopped and looked at me with the directness that had always been her particular quality, the thing that had made her students either love her or find her terrifying, usually both. She said, "Cecilia, I want to say something and I want you to hear it properly." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "What happened to you in that house was a particular kind of violence. Not the kind that leaves visible marks, but violence nonetheless. The kind that works by convincing you to doubt yourself, to make yourself smaller, to accept a version of reality that someone else constructed because it was convenient for them. And the reason I'm saying this is not to revisit something painful but because I want you to know that I saw it happening from the outside, and I want you to know that the you I saw in that house, the diminished, apologetic, uncertain version was not you. It was never you. The you sitting across from me right now is the you I have known for 26 years, and she has been there the whole time and she is formidable, and I am very glad she's back." I said, "I was always there." She said, "I know. That's what I'm saying." We walked out into the afternoon and went in our separate directions, and I took the number 14 bus back to the small house and sat in the kitchen with my notebook and wrote down what Margaret had said, Not because I needed to remember it, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that deserved to be written down somewhere. The appointment with Dr. Okafor was on Thursday at 8:15. I arrived at 8, which was not because I was nervous but because I believe in being early to things that matter. He came to get me from the waiting room himself rather than sending the nurse, which told me he had thought about this appointment before I arrived. We sat in his office rather than the examination room, which was also deliberate and also told me something. He was treating this as a conversation rather than a clinical event, which was the right instinct. I put the notebook on his desk and the photographs of Renata's symptom notes beside it, and I walked him through the past 7 months in the same chronological, documented way I had walked Arthur through it 3 weeks earlier. Dr. Okafor listened with his hands folded on the desk and his expression entirely neutral, which is the expression of a physician who is hearing something that is making him reassess a number of previous appointments and is being careful not to let his reaction get ahead of his understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cecilia, I owe you an apology." I said, "You don't." He said, "I do. I allowed a pattern to develop in our appointments where another person's account of your symptoms was given weight equal to your own account of your experience. That is a lapse in practice that I should have caught, and I didn't catch it, and I'm sorry. The notes in your file from the past 6 months reflect a clinical picture that was, I can now see, being constructed rather than observed, and I am going to be reviewing and annotating those entries to ensure they are accurate." I said, "That's all I needed to hear." He said, "I'd also like to do a full evaluation, a genuine one, independent, comprehensive, so that there is a clear and current record of your actual cognitive status in your file. Not because I have any concern about it. Because I want there to be a document that says, unambiguously, what is true." I said, "Schedule it whenever you like." He said, "I'll have the front desk call you this afternoon." I stood to leave and then I turned back and said, "Raymond, I want you to know something. The woman who was accompanying me to those appointments, who was speaking for me, who was describing symptoms I didn't have, she did this deliberately and with a specific legal purpose in mind. I am telling you this not so that you feel worse about what happened but so that you understand the full picture, because you may, at some point, be asked to provide records or testimony relevant to a legal proceeding, and I want you to have the accurate version of events." He looked at me. He said, "Understood." I said, "Thank you. You're a good doctor." This was a situation that was designed to be difficult to see clearly, and I don't hold you responsible for not seeing it immediately. He said, "That's generous of you." I said, "It's accurate. There's a difference." He almost smiled. He said, "That sounds like something you've said before." I said, "I've had occasion to say it several times this week." The evaluation happened the following Tuesday. I drove myself there, filled out the paperwork myself, answered every question clearly and without assistance, and left with the particular satisfaction of a person who has been told, in clinical language and by a credentialed professional, that their mind is functioning exactly as it should. I called Arthur from the parking lot. I said, "I have the evaluation results." He said, "Excellent. Send them over when you can." I said, "I'll drop them off this afternoon. I'll be passing by." He said, "I'll be here." I said, "Arthur, how is it moving?" He said, "It is moving exactly as planned, Cecilia. Renata's attorney has indicated she is prepared to accept the terms of the resolution agreement, which means no formal criminal prosecution in exchange for a full withdrawal from the property, a signed acknowledgement of the actions taken and their impact, and a financial penalty that, while it will not make you whole, will register as a consequence." I said, "And Daniel?" He said, "Daniel has indicated he would like to be present at the signing as a witness. He has also separately retained his own counsel, which suggests he is taking his own situation seriously." I said, "Good." Arthur said, "There is one more thing." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Renata has asked, through her attorney, whether you would be willing to have a brief conversation with her directly before the signing. Not a negotiation. A conversation." I was quiet for a moment. Arthur said, "You don't have to. It is entirely your choice and I have opinions about it, but the choice is yours." I said, "What are your opinions?" He said, "Professionally, I think it is unnecessary and potentially complicated. Personally," he paused, which was unusual for Arthur. "Personally, I think you already know what you want to do." I said, "I do." He said, "Then you don't need my opinion." I said, "I'll think about it." I drove to his office and dropped off the evaluation and drove home, and I sat in the south-facing kitchen and thought about it. The truth was that I had been thinking about it since before Arthur mentioned it, because I had known, in the way that you know things before they are confirmed, that it was coming. Renata was a woman who needed to understand what had happened to her plan. Not to apologize. I did not expect an apology and would not have trusted one if it came. But to understand. To look at the thing that had not worked and try to comprehend why it had not worked, because people like Renata always needed to comprehend. I also had something I wanted her to comprehend. Not for my sake. I had already done what I needed to do for my sake. The house was mine, the money was mine, my mind was documented and clear, my friends were restored to me, my garden was beginning, and I had, in the past 3 weeks, more fully inhabited my own life than I had in the 7 months prior or, if I was honest with myself, in the longer period before that when the slow erosion had been happening more quietly. I wanted to see her for her sake. Which sounds improbable perhaps. But I had been a teacher for 34 years. And one of the things that 34 years of teaching does to a person is make them unable to encounter someone who has made a serious error without wanting them to understand the nature of the error. Not as punishment. As information. I called Arthur back. I said I'll do it. He said I'll arrange it. It happened on a Friday morning, in a neutral conference room in Arthur's office building. Renata arrived with her attorney. I arrived with Arthur. We sat across from each other at a small table, and I looked at her properly for the first time in weeks. She looked tired. Not broken, I did not want broken, it would have been too easy, but tired in the way of someone who has been running a complicated operation for a long time and has recently had to stop running it without quite knowing how to be still. She was dressed carefully, as she always was, and her expression was composed, as it always was, and underneath the composition there was something that I thought was the closest she was capable of getting to uncertainty. Her attorney started to say something preliminary and I said quietly, I'd like to speak first if you don't mind, and he stopped and Renata looked at me. I said, I'm not here to tell you what you did was wrong. You know what you did was wrong. I'm not here to express anger. Because I'm not angry, or not primarily. I'm here because I think there is something you don't understand and I think it would be useful to you to understand it. She said nothing. But she was listening. I said, you looked at me when you moved into my house and you saw what you expected to see. A woman in her 70s, recently widowed, health conditions requiring management, living alone in a large house. You saw a person whose position was declining and whose assets were not being actively defended and you made a calculation. I understand the calculation. I even understand the logic of it from a certain angle. I paused. I said, what you didn't see was the thing that you were actually dealing with. You saw the surface. You saw the garden and the small bedroom and the coffee machine in the garage and the mail disappearing without complaint. And you read all of those things as evidence that I was what you needed me to be, diminished, manageable, fading. And you were thorough, Renata. I want to give you that. You were genuinely thorough. She said very quietly, what did I miss? I said, you missed the 43 years of a marriage to a man who taught me to build things that couldn't be seen from the outside. You missed the 34 years of a career spent watching people underestimate quiet women and the education that gave me in exactly how those underestimations work, and how to let them proceed without correcting them until the moment that correction serves your interests. You missed the notebook. You missed the calls made from a bedroom with a closed door. You missed the property 4 miles away. You missed the grandchildren who called every month and the son in Portland who was paying attention, and the lawyer who had known me for 22 years and the friend who had been watching from 3 houses down. I stopped. I said, you built your plan on the assumption that a woman who doesn't argue is a woman who can't. That's the thing you missed. I didn't argue because I was deciding. And by the time you handed me $20 and told me not to come back, everything that needed deciding had already been decided. She was quiet for a long time. Her attorney shifted in his seat. Arthur was perfectly still. Then Renata said in a voice that was stripped of everything performative, just her actual voice, smaller than I had ever heard it. She said, I didn't think you had anyone. I said, I know. I also know that you made sure I appeared not to, which is different from actually being alone. She looked at the table. Then she looked back at me. She said, I had convinced myself that what we were doing would eventually be better for you. That you'd be more comfortable, more cared for, that it would work out. I said, I know you had. That's the particular talent of a certain kind of selfishness. It wears the costume of concern so convincingly that eventually the person wearing it believes the costume is real. She flinched. Just slightly. I said, I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because if you go forward from this without understanding what you actually did, You will do some version of it again to someone else, and that person may not be in a position to do what I was in a position to do. And I find that I am, despite everything, unwilling to leave you with a version of events that lets you tell yourself a comfortable story about it. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Is there anything you want from me?" "Anything I could," she stopped. I said, "Sign the agreement. Leave the house with the care that it deserves. And if Daniel reaches out to you in a genuine spirit, meet that genuinely. He is not without his own accounting to do, but he is my son, and I would like him to have the chance to find his way back to himself." She said, "All right." I said, "That's all." We signed the agreement that afternoon. Renata's signature was unhesitating, which I noted with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. Daniel was present as a witness, as Arthur had indicated. He stood against the wall with his hands in his pockets, and when it was done and people were gathering their papers, he came to where I was standing and he said, "Mom," and I opened my arms and he came into them the way he used to when he was small and had done something wrong and had decided to face it, and I held my younger son in the conference room of Arthur Pennington's office building on a Friday afternoon, and let him be whoever he was trying to become. He left with Marcus, who had come down for the signing. I heard them talking in the hallway, the particular low murmur of brothers working something out, and I let them. Arthur walked me to the elevator. He said, "Well done, Cecilia." I said, "Thank you for everything, Arthur." He said, "Harold would have enjoyed this enormously." I said, "He would have found the whole thing deeply satisfying," and then pretended to be modest about it. Arthur made the sound that was a suppressed laugh. He said, "That sounds like him." I said, "It does." The elevator came and I got in and I pressed the button for the lobby, and as the doors were closing I thought about Harold, and about the small house with the south-facing kitchen, and about courage in the corner of the yard, and about what Margaret had said at lunch, that the formidable version of me had been there the whole time, had never stopped being there, had simply been waiting for the right moment. She was right, of course. She usually was. Sophie came that weekend with the second rose, the pale yellow one she called Patience, which she had named when she was 9 for reasons she could no longer fully articulate, but had said something about the color, how it didn't demand anything from you, it just waited. We planted it beside Courage, and then we sat on the back porch with coffee from the Vermont machine and we talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential, about her work, about a book she'd read, about whether the house should have a second bird feeder because a pair of cardinals had been coming to the one I'd already hung, and whether one feeder was enough for 2 cardinals or whether they needed their own. I said, "Everyone needs their own space." Sophie said, "Even cardinals?" I said, "Especially cardinals." She laughed and I laughed, and the afternoon was warm and the light was good and the 2 roses were in the ground with all the others still to come, and the garden was beginning in the way that gardens begin, quietly, deliberately, with patience and with time and with the understanding that nothing worth growing happens all at once. I thought about the $20. It was in the kitchen drawer now, the one closest to the back door, where I could see it when I came in from the garden. I had been asked by various people in various ways whether I wanted to do something symbolic with it, return it, frame it, throw it away. I had not done any of those things. I kept it where I could see it because it was useful to remember. Not the humiliation of the moment, not the smallness of the gesture, but what I had understood in the foyer on that Tuesday morning when I put on my coat and said all right then, and what I had carried with me on the bus to the one stop that mattered. I had understood that the $20 was not the measure of what I was worth to her. It was the measure of what she understood about me. It was the full extent of her comprehension of who she was dealing with, and it was catastrophically, permanently wrong. Sometimes the thing that is meant to diminish you is the clearest possible evidence that the person wielding it has no idea who you are. I had taken the bus to Arthur's office and begun the process of showing her precisely who I was, and now it was done, and the garden was beginning, and the kitchen faced south, and my granddaughter was asking me about cardinals. I said, "Get a second feeder." Sophie said, "Yeah?" I said, "They deserve their own." She said, "Okay, Grandma." She said it the way she always said it, warm and certain, the way of someone who has decided you are worth listening to and has never reconsidered that decision. I said, "Bring it next weekend when you come with the next rose." She said, "Which one am I bringing?" I said, "The white one. The one your grandfather planted the year you were born." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you remember what he called it?" I said, "He let you name it, Sophie. When you were 2. You called it Baby." She laughed. She said, "I called it Baby?" I said, "You called everything Baby when you were 2. The cat. The neighbor's dog. The bread in the breadbasket. Everything was baby. She was still laughing. She said, and he kept the name? I said, he said it was the best name anyone had ever given a rose. He said it made it sound beloved, which was what it was. She stopped laughing, not in the way of something ending but in the way of something settling, the way laughter settles when it becomes something quieter and more permanent. She said, Grandma. I said, She said, I love you. I said, I love you too, sweetheart. We sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, the two of us, and the cardinals came to the feeder and went and came again, and the roses were in the ground and everything was beginning. I was not a woman who had been handed $20 and told not to come back. I was a woman who knew the difference between being told to leave and choosing to go. I was a woman who had taken the bus to one secret stop, and from that stop had done, quietly and completely and without raising her voice once, everything that needed to be done. I was Cecilia Margaret Voss. I was 72 years old, and I was, in every sense that mattered, home. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.